Now, this comes to his book on history, his field of history. Now, in the field of history, Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah has written about 5 or 6 books on history.
Subhanallah.
His main work that most people would probably tell you about is Al-Muntazam fi Tarikh al-Muluk wal-Umam, which is the documented history in the history of the kings and nations. And this solitary work is 19 volumes.
Wow.
Now that deals with the beginning of creation up until I think the last, maybe 5 years of his, last 2 years of his life.
Wow.
So it's like almost up until the day that he died.
Subhanallah.
And that book, Al-Muntazam, upon that book is built Ibn al-Imad's Shadarat al-Dhahab,
Wow.
Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya by Ibn Kathir. Like all subsequent history books are built on top of Al-Muntazam. That's the depth of his research and study.
MashaAllah.
To remember the names of the Abbasid Khulafa and the Bani Umayyah, he's made like rhyming couplets so you can remember the names in order. He's given their name, their laqab, both parents and their lineages. Like he's even like gone into like their complexion. So some of the Bani Umayyah were like dark, some were light, some were tall, some were short, some had freckles. Like, or one of them had like a damaged eye, and one of them walked with a limp. Like, he really went into depth on these topics. Battles, how many died in a battle? How many survived? How many were taken prisoner? Earthquakes, all these other things. Prophecies that were fulfilled. Like, I used heavy portions of Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah for the Signs of the End of Time series.
Right.
I built a lot on top of him because Barzanji built a lot of his stuff on top of him. So when I was citing Ibn Kathir, I was pretty much citing Ibn Al-Jawzi. And when I was citing Ibn Al-Imad, I was pretty much citing Ibn Al-Jawzi, other than the events that happened after Ibn Al-Jawzi's life. But during his life and those things, it's pretty much Ibn Al-Jawzi. You know, he was fantastic, fantastic historian, very, very, very sharp historian. In the introduction of Al-Muntazam, he has a large discussion about the earth, its continents, the oceans of the earth, the size of the earth. His position was that the earth was probably almost 1 time larger than the measurements we have today. His position regarding the sun, why eclipses happen, the distance of the sun from the earth, the weight of the earth. He's the first one that I know of that mentioned the weight of the earth based upon the weight of rocks and things like this. The movement of the earth, seasonal changes, the different languages and people throughout the different flora and fauna. These types of things, he went into startling detail. He also spoke with people who had been circumnavigating at that time the globe. So he also gathered data from them, from distant lands and what they were to gather, separating the wheat from the chaff. Like, you could tell, okay, this is probably fantastic, this statement. So no, that's not true. But this part is more likely because of what we know on these types of things. So his discussions about why water sometimes becomes salty, what can make salty water fresh water, like the early discussions about desalinization, a lot of these other topics he covers in this first volume. The history of the earth from its time of being uninhabited to being inhabited, man's eventual coming down to earth, and what does that mean and how does that factor in. He deals with a lot of these topics. The age of the earth, because Christians and Jews up until recently had been saying that the world was 6,000 years old.
Right.
The Orthodox Jews still say that. And so their calendar's on 5858 is the year, I think, right now. So they believe the earth was made about almost 6,000 years ago. And the Christians, especially the Protestants, up until recently, had been saying the earth was made in the year 4000, around 4004 BC, according to Archbishop Usher, at 10 in the morning on October 22nd, was his exact date, right? Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah says you cannot assume that the days mentioned in the Quran are referring to days as you and I understand them. And he gives a litany of other ayats to establish this point. So we are not young earth creationists. He discusses the reason why the world was so old is because it's been here far before people were here, and we came down quite late, right? We came to earth from Al-Jannah and we came down here late. So the earth is obviously more ancient and will appear that way because of these reasons, right? So these types of things, he's dealing with historical data, but also like theological questions that could arise out of that, which I think are just as relevant today as they were back then.
Besides his expertise in all of these funun, it just shows you how much barakah he had in his time as well.
Yes. Yeah, because he's using all of his time to assist people and all these other things, and to get out this knowledge to people, right? So he has another book on this area dealing with history, but more dealing with the wise sayings in history, which is Akhbar al-Ziraf wal-Mutamajinin. Now, this kitab is a book that deals with the prophets and the ashab alayhim salatu wassalam, but it also talks about wise sayings from them, where they lived, the times they lived in, peculiar things about them. So this kitab, Akhbar al-Ziraf wal-Mutamajinin, it deals with a lot of these areas. So it's a slim book. It's almost 200 pages. And it talks about things such as this. He has another kitab. This kitab is called at-Tafsirah. Now, Tafsirah is 3 volumes, and at-Tafsirah deals with history, but it also talks about the different people that lived in different times. Sometimes they'll supply you with like du'as of different kings, like this righteous Muslim king. He had this du'a. He said this. He lived in a faraway land. These righteous prophets. So they'll do the takhrij and the ahadith and talk about these types of things, right? So he has a lot of good things like this. He has poetry included within the book, like old poetry. He has another book called Al-Hadaiq fi ilm al-hadith wa zahdiyat, which, although covering Zuhd and other things, also discusses history through the hadith. So he'll try to retrace the steps of historical events by using hadith and other things. But then he'll also take from historical events what lessons we can learn from hadith, like the first murder. What Zuhd lessons can we take from this? Like, what can we take from this? So his Al-Hadaiq is a very good kitab. It's 3 volumes. He has another kitab, which is it's called, this is less about history, more to do with language, because he wrote books also on the Arabic language. Taqweem al-Lisan, which is about mistakes that are made by non-Arabic speakers as they're acquiring knowledge of the language. And then also how the Arabic language, through diffusion of people, has been affected by foreign things coming into it and affecting the language. So he also said that people have to be careful to guard their grammar and things like this, to not make errors when they speak. This book is about 300 pages old, 300 pages long. Very sound book. He has another one about how to raise children, which is Tanbih al-Na'im al-Ghumr ala Mawasim al-Umr. This is about how to raise children. And this book is it's about 50 pages. It talks about the different phases that children go through,
MashaAllah.
the different things that happen to them, how they develop, and how they become stronger and better, and how you as a person can guide and guard that. Then you have Sifat al-Safwa, which is 4 volumes, which is a history of all the mutasawwifa from the first 3 generations, all the big zahids, all the big sufis, all the big abids, all these people, from the Sahaba all the way, their story, when they lived, how long they lived, the Zuhdi practices and things that they did, right? Really a cut above.
Didn't he also write several manaqib books on the Zuhad?
Yes, he wrote one on the Manaqib of Imam Ahmed. He wrote other literature on other people, historical people, like one on Hasan Al-Basri. Yes.
Ibrahim ibn Adham, I believe, as well.
Yes. He has another one called Ruh al-Arwah, which may have been some of the influence for Imam Ibn al-Qayyim's Kitab al-Ruh,
right,
which is about matters of the heart and other affairs, but it's written in a very academic manner. Then you have his Kitab al-Qasas wal-Mudhakirin, which is about wise stories and things from the past. It also shows you how to deliver a dars, how to speak publicly without having stage fright, how to deliver topics correctly without making historical errors, right? And he uses the background of different people to do that. Then he has this kitab. It's called Muthir al-Azm al-Sakin ila Sharaf al-Amakin. This book is about all the noble places on earth to visit. Al-Quds, Mecca, Al-Medina, how old they are, where certain prophets are buried, where certain people are buried, where certain righteous people are buried, seeking them out, visiting them, gaining barakah, and gaining nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through visiting the righteous people.
Such books can be used when it comes to times such as today where they destroy graves and the like.
Yes, like these books are very useful to understand these places, find them and revive them, right? Fada'il al-Quds, this is the virtues of Jerusalem, which is 200 pages, right? So he talks about the history of Jerusalem, first masjids built there, all these other things were done. So this is his historical stroke Zuhdi accounts of affairs in terms of his literature. Then he also deals with tafsir. Now in tafsir, he has 4 books in a curriculum. He has 4 books in a tafsir curriculum he's created. Okay, I'll start with the first, which is I'll start with one, which is Zad al-Masir fi ilm al-Tafsir, because I've taught this. This is the middlemost kitab, which originally was going to be a lot larger, but some of the students complained and asked for him to reduce it in size. When I read the introductory remarks, he said, I've tried to make this book small so that it might be memorized. Now, this book is when one double fist size volume in Arabic print, which is like font 9 traditional Arabic. In normal Arabic print, it's 4 volumes. This was your tafsir literature. It took me 5 years to finish teaching this book. But his tafsir, his Zad al-Masir fi ilm al-Tafsir, it combines together all the 4 methods of tafsir. Because there's 4 main methods of tafsir. One is hadith based, one is Quran with Quran, one is language based in ahkam, and then there's one is universalist, which is Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah. He combines all those styles. So you get everything. And I thought I was going to finish it in a year, but we reached the end of Surah Al-Baqarah in a year. And I thought, subhanallah wa bihamdi. I thought, because I generally have projections in my mind of how far I want to go. But as I got through, I realized, no, this isn't going to be a year.
Yes.
It's going to be something bigger. Because one of my teachers had taught Qurtubi's Jami al-Ahkam al-Qur'an, and he'd done that in 2 years. But that text is huge. And I thought, well, Ibn Al-Jawzi's is 4 volumes, so it shouldn't be. But then as I'm going through it, I'm realizing it's fleshier. Although Qurtubi is larger, Qurtubi's language is simpler than Ibn Al-Jawzi. His language is simpler. It's more compact. Whereas Ibn Al-Jawzi, he writes in literary Arabic. He writes in literary Arabic. Like, you'll read his Arabic stuff. Like, even the books I was reading, I was kind of stuttering because the way he writes and his style, it will make you stutter. It's a literary Arabic. This is an Arabic that's written for people who are literate and read regularly. You will stutter trying to read his books. That's why it kind of makes me smile. I see some of these things like printed in Arabic. I was like, I wonder if the publisher could even read this while he was like typing it up, or like, could he even, like, if you even ask somebody to sit down, because a lot of his books don't even have tashkil. It's like, could you just read like his opening khutbah? And they would just be, they'd bite their tongue by accident or something, because it's just his books, subhanAllah, Ibn Al-Jawzi's books, I mean, they're really, really designed for people who read. He's laid down like a foundation stone. Now he's got another kitab. It's called تلقيح فهوم أهل الأثر في عيون التاريخ والسير. Now this is a book on the history of righteous people, but also major historical incidents, and it covers some areas of tafsir and ilm. The reason why he did this is to show historical precedent for our understanding of certain things in hadith knowledge and in tafsir. So he said the first person to ever utter this statement in tafsir was this one. No one knew about it before that time. You see how he keeps going back to the first 3 generations and trying to establish like precedent and where the first arguments happened. That's his whole thing. And that's why Imam Rajab rahimahullah said few people knew as much about the first 3 generations and their ahwal than Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah. Few people. Because of how diligent he was in studying these matters. He was just so diligent and so insistent. He then has under tafsir, it's called Tazkiratul Arib fi Tafsir al-Gharib, Gharib al-Qur'an al-Kareem. Now this deals with words in the Arabic language that are unusual. It's a tafsir of these words. It's a tafsir of ayat, but it's also tafsir of unusual words that are already rare in the Arabic language. So it deals with those affairs, very crisp, very clear, very easy to make out, because it's designed to be like that. He has another kitab. It's called Nawasikh al-Qur'an. Now this deals with what ayat in the Qur'an are abrogated, like what ahkam are abrogated, what are not, which ones can you use for rulings, which ones can you not. Right? He has another one, Al-Hathu ala hifz al-ilmi wa dhikr al-kibar al-hufaz. Admonition on preserving knowledge and making mention for barakah of the senior scholars of hifz. So this deals with the big scholars of tafsir and hadith, their history, their contributions to the field, and what they left behind for us today. This is what he's left behind in this regard. Then he has another kitab in tafsir, which deals with a breakdown of the Quran itself in terms of how many surahs are there, how many letters are there, how many, right? So he breaks down all these things. How many letters are there? How many surahs are there? How many words are there in each one? So each time, each aspect someone can look at, they can take something away and say, oh, there's only this many of this. This like he has a section where he talks about if somebody wants to finish the Quran in 7 days, where do they have to read from?
Subhanallah.
If somebody wants to finish the Quran in a month, how would they do that? If someone wants to finish the Quran in a year, how would they do that? So he goes into painstaking detail on how to complete these affairs. He has a book, Kitab al-Kaba'ir, تذكرة أول البصائر في معرفة الكبائر, which is a book that discusses the major sins mentioned in the book and Sunnah, but he provides ayat and ahadith for all of them. He has another one on the Quran, نزهة العيون النواظر في علم الوجوه والنظائر. So this is a book that covers similes and other things that are used in the book and Sunnah, how they relate and how one can access them. So again, we're still talking about tafsir.
Right.
We're still talking about tafsir.
Subhanallah.
So this is the level of this man's ilm regarding his tafsir and affairs connected to tafsir, right? Because people will look at tafsir and they might see only one thing. Or they might look at tafsir and think, oh, this is, tafsir is just the tafsir of the Quran. No, that's a part of it, but it's not all of it. It's a part of it. And it has to be looked at in perspective because the tafsir brings out so many other things. And we don't always consider that. But then when you start looking at it for what it is, you start saying to yourself, subhanallah, look at all this. Then you start really appreciating it.
And is the science of tafsir distinct from ulum al-Qur'an?
It can be, depending on what because ulum al-Qur'an could cover things like the language of the Qur'an, the qira'at of the Qur'an, right? So the different qira'at and the ways it's recited.
The abrogated and the like.
That's it. But when you start talking about the tafsir will talk about the meanings behind things. What's in things. So what can be used as hukm and what can't, right? So all these types of things, these kutub, he deals with in a systematic and detailed fashion, the like of which you don't find very many people that leave behind what he does. Now we come to his area of al-i'tiqad. In al-i'tiqad, Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah, you can see his i'tiqad in Sayyid al-Khatir, which is Sayyid al-Khatir is not a book of i'tiqad as we discussed before, but it has it in it. It has i'tiqad in it. You can see his position there. But his final statement really is his book, Kitab Akhbar us-Sifat, which the book of the Akhbar us-Sifat, referring to the Sifat al-Khabariyyah. It's from this book you can see that Daf Shubah at-Tashbih is related to this kitab. But you'll find that most people that talk about Daf Shubah at-Tashbih don't read Kitab Akhbar us-Sifat, which will apply all of his final discussion.
And how large are these two books?
Akhbar al-Sifat, Kitab Akhbar al-Sifat is 130 pages. Daf Shubah at-Tashbih, and a lot of printings, the one through Kawthari, where he put in some despicable footnotes, that one it's like 93 pages or something like that. So for that one, people will look at Daf Shubah at-Tashbih without understanding the background of the discussion that Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah was having, which was an in-house discussion.
Yeah, this is a very extremely important topic, actually, as of today.
The discussion was about not all sifat. The discussion wasn't about sifat al-af'al or the sifat al-fi'liyah, the sifat of action. It wasn't about sifat al-Zatiyah, sifat the essence. It wasn't about those 14. It wasn't about the af'al. It was about the sifat al-Khabariyyah. These are the sifat that are a particular class of sifat that are discussed. The Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah, he, in this area, when you look at Kitab Akhbar al-Sifat, under the chapter of Akhbar al-Sifat, he actually neither affirmed nor denied them.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't do ithbat and he didn't do nafi. He was walking some other position because he said his position was that the sifat, these are not sifat. These are idafat.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about the Kaaba being the Bayt of Allah, house of Allah,
Mm-hmm.
you talk about someone being Rasulullah, the messenger of Allah, or Allah's messenger. Bayt Allah, Allah's house. This is a possessive construction.
Mm-hmm.
In Arabic, it's called an idafa. This is what he said this was. So we said these are not sifat al-Khabariyyah. These are, the sifat al-Khabariyyah are not sifat like the sifat al-Af'al, sifat al-Zatiyah. These are idafat.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what caused the issue. Now, people will often make the statement that, well, he was just like this group of people here. No, he was not.
Mm-hmm.
Because those who would say that he was similar to them don't understand whether they affirm that the sifat al-Khabariyyah have a haqiqah,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
or they don't have a haqiqah. Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah was not affirming either. He didn't affirm either.
Mm-hmm.
Because he said they're not sifat. You can't affirm a haqiqah or a majaz for some. If you listen, this isn't a sifa. It's an idafa.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it refers to other things. So people say, oh, well, did Imam Joseph interpret something? No. Because ta'wil is sarf al-lafz ila al-lafz al-akhar. It's moving something from one meaning to another
Mm-hmm.
meaning. You can't do that if you don't think something is a sifa.
Right.
So he wasn't doing ithbat or nafi. And this is what Imam Qudam rahimahullah and others said. We didn't like that.
SubhanAllah.
Because that's something that's never been there.
Right.
He said that by affirming the sifat al-Khabariyyah as sifat and not looking at them as idafat, necessarily you would fall into Tashbih.
Mm-hmm.
Necessarily. Now, the argument that he had are against elders who are his senior or his own teachers. Like Ibn al-Zaghuni, Al-Qadi Abu Ya, the elder, Al-Baghdadi rahimahullah wa radahu, who his books are with us today.
Mm-hmm.
I have Ibtal al-Ta'wilat, and I have the manuscript of it as well, because the printed form of it, only the first 2 volumes are printed. I have all 3 volumes
Mm-hmm.
in manuscript form. There's nothing in there that calls to major kufr or major shirk in Allah's names and attributes. Just as al-idah, which I have, which I've read as targeted reading. There's nothing in there that calls a major shirk and major kufr.
So the claim out there is
if you look at it, if you look at Ibn Hamid,
mm-hmm. Yes.
I have his kitab. There's nothing that calls a major shirk or major kufr. The situation with Imam Jawzi rahimahullah was this. He said, if you affirm these as khabariyah and say they have a haqiqah as sifat, necessarily that will cause tashbih, because these are not sifat, they are idafat.
Right.
And that's why he did the same thing at Akhbar al-Sifat. He said, look at the statement. The black stone is Yameen Allah. It's the right hand of Allah. He said, here is a perfect example of an idafa.
Mm-hmm.
He says, so therefore, bal yadahu mabsutatan, he said, that's an idafat too. You see what he did?
Yes.
That's exactly what he did. He said, look, this says you mean Allah. Look, it has the exact same construction. Bal yadahu mabsutatan. Look, that's not a sifa, it's an idafa, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing control and dominion to this thing that belongs to him by saying this. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. If you say it's a sifa, then what you are actually going to go into tashsim or tashbih. Mm-hmm. If you say it's a sifa. That was his position. He never said that their writings are filled within that writing. He said it's tantamount to, if you do it, because of the position that he held in i'tiqad. He said it's tantamount to. He never said definitely it's that, because you have to remember, and say the ul-Khatir, he's clear that the Mujassima are kuffar. So the Mu'attila. But he also says under a chapter in say the ul-Khatir, under Ithbat al-Sifat, he said the natural statement of Sifat is that you affirm them. And even if the person affirming them misunderstands them in his affirmation, he said it's better than the one that interprets them and does ta'wil. He said because those people are closer to ta'til, which is the door to atheism. Mm-hmm. That's Sayyid al-Khatir. Mm-hmm. So we know he wasn't in favor of ta'wil.
Right.
Not like what's being called to today.
Yes.
But what's more important than that, we also have another picture into Imam Al-Jawzi's i'tiqad, because years ago, Ibn Furak, as the Ash'ari madhhab was crystallizing, the Ibn Furak was a near contemporary of Al-Qadi Abu Ya al-Baghdadi, rahimahullah, who died 458 Hijri. And in response to what was being said, because some of the early Ash'aris, the madhhab was crystallizing, had said that because the discussion was, are the sifat, do they have a haqiqah, or are they majaz?
Right.
And some of those Ash'aris said, no, they're majaz, which means they have a haqiqah, and people said, no, you're kuffar. No. Because if you say the sifat don't have a haqiqah, of a reality, then that's kufr, because they have to exist, because everyone understood haqiqah in this sense is referring to their wujud, their existence, right? That they exist. If you say they're majaz, we're back at the Mu'tazila again.
So we're negating the attributes.
That's it, which is where you came from anyway. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's why you use the same terminology, right? This was the concern. But when some of the Ash'aris are saying, no, we mean it in the usul of fiqh sense, because usul of fiqh sense for haqiqah will mean as you understand it in your frame of reference. Mm. But it had already been established before the haqiqah being used in i'tiqad has a particular sense that's meant. Mm-hmm. It's already been established. So you don't go to usul of fiqh when the word haqiqah is already being used in a sense in i'tiqad that's been established. Well, Imam Al-Qadi Abu Ya rahimahullah al-Baghdadi, he writes the book Ibtal al-Ta'wilat. He includes within that kitab the same statements that Ibn Furak had that were da'if jiddan or wahin, but he used them to show that even the proofs that you're using can be shown to be our proofs as well, mm-hmm. because of their application. And he started off by saying, I don't understand why those among you that preceded you in this era said they didn't know the names of the attributes and that their realities only Allah knew them. Now you say you know them and that they have no reality. This is the beginning of Talat Ta'wilat. So he submits this big kitab. It's met with wide acceptance, including the Khalifa of his time, Al-Qadir Billah, mm-hmm. who now it only is condemned because it has narratives in it that are da'if jiddan or wahin, but we've already explained why those mm-hmm. were in there. So the Khalifa asks him to clarify. So what does he do? He clarifies it by writing a mukhtasar of al-Ta'wilat, which is called al-Mu'tamid. This is the condensed form, which that is also accepted. The Khalifa then does a summary of that. And all of the scholars, other than a few who are named, sign that to say that is the true creed of Muslim Orthodox. Okay. Now, Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah reproduces the entire text of this creed in Al-Muntazam and calls it the correct creed.
MashaAllah.
Now, I want you to process that for a second. If he calls that the correct creed, al-i'tiqad al-Qadiri is what he called it.
Right.
Now, that is a mukhtasar of al-Mu'tamid. Al-Mu'tamid is a mukhtasar of ibtal al-Ta'wilat. If he thought Al-Qadi Abu Ya, the elder rahimahullah, was mujassim, why would he say it's the correct creed?
MashaAllah. SubhanAllah.
It's right in there.
Right.
So we have to understand Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah's strangeness was only in the Akhbar al-Sifat, or also referred to as the Sifat al-Khabariyyah. But the way he's being used today, he does not share with them in that area.
So the claim today is that due to these statements that he is what they call him an Ash'ari. So
well, my response to that would be to go back to the quote that I gave from Sayyid al-Khatir, because that's not a good opinion on Ta'wil. And in addition to that, he affirmed the wujud or the haqiqah that the sifat have by affirming al-i'tiqad al-Qadiri. And the signatories to it, the only people who were not signatories to it were some of the Ash'ari who said that they were majaz. Now that would make you then understand by his lauding that, because he gives the introduction to al-i'tiqad al-Qadiri as well, and does kind of a little bit of a sharh on it too. That would make you understand then that he does not share the position that the sifat don't have a haqiqah.
Right.
His issue is that the sifat al-Khabariyyah aren't sifat. So he doesn't do ithbat or nafi. He said, listen, these aren't sifat. But he doesn't share with them in making ta'wil and that these are majaz. And that's a completely different discussion. Had he had that discussion that is shared by some people today that say he's an Ash'ari, he would have disagreed and said, well, you should stay with the signatories. I don't agree, and that's why I'm with the people who didn't sign it. But everyone signed it.
Right.
In fact, he goes on, and Al-Jawzi says, a century later, it was brought out again, and people were doing tabarruk with it and being reminded of it. Again, so this means after Imam Al-Qadi Abu Ya al-Baghdadi rahimahullah's death, a century after that, this is in his time. Because you got to remember, he dies 597. Al-Qadi Abu Ya dies. So this is near to his end of his life. He says, got brought out again. What's it doing back out again? I thought if it's back out again, well, because of flare-ups and other things like that. Yes. But it was seen as a relic of the previous Khalifa. The people did tabarruk with it. And they looked at the names on it again and signed it again. Now, we have to understand, Akhi, this is history. We're not talking about cliches.
Yes.
We're not talking about personal opinions and I feel, and my opinion is, this is history. That's in the record. So we now have an accurate snapshot, not just through his kutub, but Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah's understanding of history on what his theology was. His only issue is the Sifat al-Khabariyyah being Sifat or not. But when you're looking at his overall, everything else, you find he believes the Sifat have a haqiqah and they're not majaz.
SubhanAllah.
and he's not, and he stands against ta'wil in reality. But the same people that translated Daf Shubah Tashbih that were unqualified, which I'd said at the time that they hadn't studied comparative creed, and you can tell by their translation that they're unqualified. This was said because I was one of the people on the proofreading staff. And I said, don't do this. Because I could tell that they had not read any comparative creed, and they'd not read the rest of Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah, his theological heritage, to get an understanding of that. They hadn't read his statements on al-i'tiqad al-Qadiri. They'd not read Akhbar us-Sifat. They'd not looked at ul-Khatir. They'd not looked at his entire, because again, as we say, Hanbalis write books as a curriculum or in a series of books. You read all of these to get a full gist. Because you have to understand, these men are coming out of an entire theological tradition that goes back centuries, where they defended the religion and they were the torchbearers of the religion. They didn't come, you have to remember, they didn't come out of Ahlul Bid'ah. So they're writing from a position of strength, where they always wrote from, not from a position of defense. So those books that are written by the Hanbali elders are always written from a position of offense and a position of preemption, not defense. It's preemption. Those books are preemptive. They're never defensive. So when quotes are taken and written like this, or quotes are taken from them and written in a defensive posture, there's nothing defensive about them. Because up until the 440s, they were Ahlul Sunnah. There isn't any other Ahlul Sunnah. Maturidis are in this, they're in Central Asia. So they are Ahlul Sunnah. There is nothing else. So we have to get that straight.